Okay, thank you, Dennis, for that. He does have some brochures up here on the front. If anybody's interested in one, you can pick them up as you leave. I also have a pair of reading glasses. If anybody may have lost them, we'll have them up here on the table. Okay, our next speaker is Mr. Glenn Smith, Records Management Analyst with the Library of Virginia. While command level leaders typically do not perform the day-to-day functions of designated records officer, they do need to understand the necessity and the sound for records management program. So Glenn, if you come on up, please.
You might tell him he made an extra effort.
And he made an extra effort to be here because there was a mix-up in the schedule, and he was actually here yesterday, I believe, and he came back today, so we certainly appreciate that.
Thank you, folks. Appreciate it. It's good to be with you. Twice. You guys had a great venue here. Got to see some pretty awesome things yesterday in the exhibitor area as well. So I appreciate you having me. You know, it's always great to wrap up with that thing that most folks acquaint with watching paint dry. So I'll take comfort in the fact that I'm not the after lunch speaker. But what we're going to talk about today is something that really is critical to underlying what you guys do every day. It's documenting those things that you do. It's making sure that documentation is around for as long as it needs to be, but no longer than it needs to be. So what the heck really is records management? And basically, this is it in a nutshell. It's taking the information that you need, you make it accessible to who needs it in the timeliest manner possible, in the most efficient means possible, and then when it comes time to get rid of it, you do that, and you do that with the least amount of cost possible. That is records management in a nutshell. But we're government, and nutshell rarely covers it. Why does it matter? In my face-to-face down in the weeds training, there's a screen here with about 12 different things on it as to why we do records management. But at the command level, these are the three that I want to focus on, and mostly I want to look at the first one, ensure compliance. That's kind of what you guys are all about, is ensuring compliance. Little different framework, little different setup, little different set of armor to go with it, but that's what you guys are about. And that's really what is one of the things that underlies records management, is helping us. I mean, we're government. There's very little that we do that is not directed by policy, mandate, or decree. And oftentimes we're being looked at, are we complying with those things? How is that typically accomplished? What's that tool that shows up in your office every once in a while that says, are you doing it? An audit. Who loves audits? You do them, don't you? Anybody ever had an auditor that was just willing to take your word for it? No. Say again? Doesn't exist. That creature does not exist. What are they going for? They're going for the record. And that's why sound records management matters. Getting rid of what you don't need matters also. More and more we're going to electronic records, and I need to find a way to give you a word picture about electronic records, but for right now I'm still stuck with paper. One file cabinet sitting in an office that costs $20 per square foot. And even in the most rural part of Virginia, I would really challenge you to show me main office space that equates to $20 a square foot. Downtown Richmond, the last time I checked a few years ago, was $174 a square foot. The amount of space that it takes a file cabinet to be open and to comply with ADA and to get around it is 14.5 square feet. Times $20 a square foot per month is $290 a month for that file cabinet to sit there. Do you really need what's in that file cabinet? And if you do you need it to sit where it's needed, where it's sitting? Is off-site storage a possibility? That's one of those things as command staff you guys need to be considering. So just like everybody else, records management does not operate in a vacuum. We operate under the Virginia Public Records Act, 42.1-76 et sec. And that basically has quite a few things in it that are very clear-cut, like every other piece of wonderfully crafted, honed to a T Virginia legislation. Okay, those parts might not be quite so clear, but there are definite parts. And the parts that are say that anything that walks, talks, and looks like government has to designate a records officer, which is the liaison between your agency and ours. You have to implement a records management program. You need to identify what your public records are. It really speaks specifically to electronic records, that you have to manage those just as much as you manage paper records. And that includes destroying electronic records when their retention period runs out. Just because it's sitting in an electronic system hidden by a bunch of ones and zeros doesn't mean you keep it forever. I promise you. And when the time has come to destroy the records, that they are effectively destroyed according to what type of record they are, and then that destruction gets reported to the LVA, the Library of Virginia. So that's what the records is that's what the VPRA, Virginia Public Records Act, is very specific about. That needs to happen. That records officer that I mentioned actually needs to be formally designated. And we're government, that takes a form. And this is the form, RM25, Records Officer Designation and Responsibilities. Those bullets that you see at the top of the form is, again, the word nutshell of the responsibilities that that records officer and you as the person designating that records officer, because typically that role lives at a lower level, not always, but typically at a lower level than the command staff, that these are the things that you all are agreeing to. Some of them apply more than others. The details are found in our Virginia Public Records Management Manual. But if you nail down these bullets, you're like 80% there. So it's right there when you, whoever in your office is doing the designating and the person being designated, sign at the bottom. You keep a copy of that. There's always the reminder of what those responsibilities are right there. We're getting ready to change this form. Oh, good gracious. I borrowed this one from an old presentation. That's not even what the current form looks like. So that's close enough. The code says that you have to develop a records management program. There needs to be an understanding as to what it entails effectively managing public records. We have several resources for that. We have, as I said, the Virginia Public Records Management Manual. We are the ones in government for both state government and locality constitutional officers who are responsible by code for developing and implementing the retention schedules. What you see on the right is a list of those general retention schedules that apply to local government. GSO 8 and GS 17 are the ones that apply to you guys the most. 17 is on the law enforcement side, 8 are the jails. And for those who are doing records management, it's always my encouragement that one of the first steps, and again, this is kind of part of where that watching paint dry thing comes in, is that you go through those schedules and familiarize yourself with what your office can have. But hear me, please. Just because a record is on a schedule doesn't mean you have to have it. Because our goal and our job is to provide general schedules that cover offices across the entire Commonwealth. And in doing so, we may include some records that apply to a larger office or apply to an office in another region of the state that may not apply to yours. So if you see something on there that does not look familiar, that's not a big deal. The code says that you're going to identify public records. What is a public record? If it documents a transaction or activity, and I'm going to use the word you guys are really familiar with, if it is evidence of something going on in government, that's part of what makes it a record. It does not matter what form it takes. I think for most of us in the room, we are way more familiar with paper than we are still with ones and zeros. But it doesn't matter if it's paper, if it's ones and zeros, if it's microfilm, rock, papyrus, or hologram. It's a record if it's documenting transaction or activity of government. And you produce it, collect it in the pursuit of law or government. Usually we think of records as stuff we create. But if you get something in from the public, if you get something in from another agency that is part of your business, then that record is just as much a record as what you create. So it documents an activity, no matter what form it is, and you collect it or create it in the pursuit of government. That is a public record. The VPRA, again, very specifically says that this applies to electronic records because all that really is, for the most part, is just another format of the same record that was in paper. Managing it can get a little different, and I've got a 2.5-hour presentation on that if you want to put a group of 25 or more together, and I'll come to you, and we'll talk about that. But it says that if you make the decision, and sometimes if that decision is made for you, that you're going to manage records in an electronic format, then you have to manage them just as effectively as they would be in paper. When non-permanent records reach the end of their life and it's time for them to be destroyed, they have to be destroyed, and that destruction has to be reported to us. For what I hope is the next 2 months, that destruction is reported on this form, this piece of paper, the RM3. And that's a sample of what a completed RM3 looks like. Everything going well at the end of 4.5 years. Come July 1, this process is going to be electronic. The information is going to be the same, but instead of completing a piece of paper, it's going to be done on a web-based form. How many here in the room know for certain that given what I've said so far, you have a designated records officer with an RM-25 on file at the Library of Virginia. Okay. That works out to about the percentage that I think. And I'll explain that in just a second. Do we have to destroy our records, our non-permanent records, when the time comes, at the end of their retention? The code says, for records that are created after July 1, 2006, and here is that wonderfully fine-tuned, well-crafted legislation, you have to destroy them in a timely manner. So they left it to us, and we say 1 year. Unless there are certain bits of data that those records contain, and there's a code section that's under the Data Collection and Dissemination Privacy Act, Data Collection and Dissemination Act, that outlines what those data points are. And if the record contains any of those, then you have 6 months after the record reaches the end of retention. And my encouragement is always, just get on a cycle and destroy everything within 6 months, and you're golden. So do you have to destroy, by code, what was created before July 1, 2006? No. But for all of the reasons that we've talked about, security, efficiency, cost, you still want to. Is there a consequence for not doing this? Are we, the Library of Virginia, going to come after you? No. There's not that many teeth in the Public Records Act. Where bad records management typically gets tried and juried is in the media. And I know law enforcement has taken some hits on that in the past few years. Don't be a headline. Good, sound records management can keep any government agency, but especially law enforcement, out of a lot of hot water. Because we all know you guys are just, you're looked at, you're scrutinized up one side of the wall and down the other. And this is just a really sound way to cover much of what needs to be covered. That is the overview of records management. For those whom you would designate, or if you would be the records officer, we have a set of training videos on our website that gets down into the nuts and bolts of what I just did the overview on. And I encourage those. When I welcome a records officer, or when somebody contacts me and said, hey, we need to do this, this is what I point folks to. Because the first 7 of those, that is slightly less than 30 minutes. You may need to do them more than once. But when you assimilate that knowledge, that is the foundation you need, and that your people will need to establish that records management program. So, speaking to law enforcement specifically, and jail specifically, I already referenced these. The 2 schedules that are going to apply to you guys more than anything is GS 17, which covers everything law enforcement, EMS, public safety, and GS 08, which covers local and regional jails. If you land on the state general schedule page, you would see something that looks like GS 117. Get off of that page. You can't use it. That is for state law enforcement agencies only. When destruction is being completed on the paper form for the next 2 months, you can make that mistake in paper. Once the electronic RM3 is implemented, there's fail-safes. You're not going to be able to do that. So that's going to be a good thing. A lot of the questions, a lot of what I have received from law enforcement in my 9 years of doing this has dealt with property and evidence, and right now I'm really in a situation where I'm having to finally come up with an answer. What in your office is evidence, and what in your office is the documentation that pertains to evidence? And for the law enforcement offices that I've talked with, would you believe that I get the same answer every time I call an office? No, not at all. There are some offices that treat their evidence, and I think the exception is guns and drugs, just like a record. And they put the same retention on evidence that whatever case file it's assigned to. There are others that follow some type of Supreme Court rules, and that's what I'm trying to figure out now, is how do Supreme Court rules apply to evidence? And at the end of this presentation and in your handout is my email address, and if somebody can definitively answer that question for me, please let me know, because there's a TV news piece that's hanging on, or a part of this is going to be part of a news article pretty soon, and I'd like to get it right. But where I am coming to now out of my research so far is that it's really up to you. Unless there is something out there that says specifically that you have to treat evidence in a certain manner, then whether you treat it as a record, whether you treat it as evidence under court order, it's whatever your locality, and typically that's going to be an arrangement between law enforcement, the court, and the Commonwealth's attorney. Whatever you decide, it's like choosing which of 3 possible record series might be the best to document destruction. Pick the one that seems the best, be consistent in its application, and document it in your policy and procedures. If you do that, the chances of you ending up as a headline for destroying something that somebody thinks should not have been, your defensibility climbs considerably. But again, if there's somebody who can inform me as to how you all manage evidence in the order process, I would appreciate hearing from you. But typically, I think that what is the record is that which documents the evidence, the chain of custody, the disposition. Those things are for sure the record that belongs to property and evidence. Another question that I get a lot from law enforcement is, I have this piece of paper and I don't know what to do with it. And my first question is, what does it do? What's the purpose of it? Well, we get it from the court and it tells us to do something. Before we updated the law enforcement schedules back in 2013, there were many series that covered what is now in this one series on GS-17 called Court Ordered and Other Processes. So basically, if somebody comes to you and says, what do I do with this process record? If it's any way at all court ordered, you're carrying out some type of function or directive that the court says, and you have a copy of that order, that's where that record series is going to be. Because your job is not specifically about the content of that case. If you're serving it, it's all about process. And there is much that goes on in the world of process that its documentation is covered by this one series. The only other process series is if we're talking about the process of protective orders. And the only difference between the two is that protective orders have a confidential destruction, and everything else, because it's all in a case file anyway, is non-confidential. Investigative case files. When the schedules were overhauled, again in 13, there were a lot of little individual series on the law enforcement schedule. They were all combined into the series that's called investigative case files. And for those who may not have seen a schedule, I'll ask you the first time that you take a look at them, please do not freak out, okay? Because there are 6 basic series on GS-17 that apply to investigative case files. 7 if you count the one that says, hey, if you have something historical going on that should be preserved forever, there is a permanent series. That's rare, believe me. Investigative case files, by and large, do not have permanent value. But there are 3 types of case files. These are technical terms: serious, less serious, and non-serious. And there's 2 technical corollaries that go along with those: resolved and unresolved. And those are the 6 series that you have to work with. And if they sound pretty vague, that's awesome, because that was the intention. That's what came out of the work group of law enforcement officers and record keepers who were on our work group overhauling that schedule. Because that gives you, your agency, the flexibility to decide where a case goes. Because there may be something at face value that looks like it's not serious. But because of circumstances specific and unique to your agency, maybe to your geographic area, there's something about that that really does justify holding that obviously non-serious case for longer, and you have that option of putting it into the serious file. Likewise, and I'm going to use a Commonwealth's attorney example, I had a question just a couple of weeks ago that something that at face value would look like a felony and would be a 20-year retention, but the question came, what about these felonies that never see the light of day in court? They're dismissed or they're null prost. Do we really need to keep those for 20 years? And I told him what every good records management analyst would say. I don't care. It's up to you. If you can make the defense that keeping something that looks at face value really isn't as important as it seems, and like that Commonwealth attorney question, felony, straight up 20 years. Except for the fact that there's absolutely nothing in there of value. So yeah, they're going to make that decision to put those felonies in their less serious case and keep them for 1 year. That's the kind of flexibility that you have in records management. But again, the defensibility of those decisions lie in that 3-pronged: make the best decision, stick to it, and document it. Those are what those series look like, except on the schedule, they're about that long. Because the description of them repeats. Because basically a case file is going to have the same information in it, no matter whether it's serious, less serious, or non-serious. So again, when you see 4 pages in a retention schedule that's documenting your case files, don't freak out. It's really not that hard to apply it. That's everything I just said. The handout's in your folder. You can go back and review those. The one thing on GS8 that I'd like to bring up here is inmate incarceration records. This is something that I've been wrestling with for a little while, and it's something that I would really like to put a small work group together for those sheriffs and regional jails that deal with this. The retention on the whole inmate incarceration file is 3 years after the inmate separates. And I know that there are some jails that are following that to a T. And I know that there are other jails that say, whoa, whoa, whoa. We want at least a part of that record for much longer than 3 years, so that we've got some idea, if this person comes back into our system, what we dealt with when they were here. So that's what I'm going to need a group of y'all's help on, is to figure out, should the entire file be held longer than 3 years, or is there a portion of an inmate incarceration record that should be held longer than 3 years, so that you have that history. You know you've got that history in case that inmate comes back around. Whoops, hitting the wrong button. I'm going, I did not put that in there again. At the command level, as I said, rarely is there somebody who is the designated records officer. But the first three videos that I pointed out to you, I will encourage whoever in your office is going to make that decision as far as making the decision as to who to designate as a records officer. I very much encourage you to review those videos, about 6 minutes. An introduction to the Public Records Act, the review of what I talked about, what is a public record, and then the third one, what are the responsibilities of a records officer? And with that knowledge in your quiver, I believe that would give you guys a better foundation to be able to make the decision as to who is the best person in your office to do that job. And as I've become fond of saying to law enforcement, just because they don't carry a gun doesn't mean they're not the best person to do it. Oftentimes it's a high-level admin who's the one who really knows the most about the records across the office. And the question that comes quite often is, can we have more than one? I would say that in most sheriff's offices across the Commonwealth, you don't need more than one. But yes, the code says you have to have at least one, but as many as you believe necessary. So that's fine. We've covered that. Here's what I want to leave you with. I asked you to show your hands, and I said that's about the right percentage. One cool thing about this endeavor to stand in front of you today is I learned that there are 3 more sheriff's offices than I thought there were. I thought, like circuit court clerks, there's 120 of you guys, but nope, there's 3 outliers. So you have 123 sheriff's offices. Out of those, in our database, we have a total of 108 designees. When you take away the ones who we no longer have an email address for, which tells us they ain't there, maybe the email address changed, but usually not, and you take out the agencies you take out the duplicates in some agencies, effectively 57 out of 123 have at most, because I've just learned since I created that screen that somebody I thought was a working email wasn't, because it wasn't bouncing back. 57 out of 108 are even at ground zero to be able to legally comply with the Public Records Act. I would be glad to work with you to get that number up. That's flying through. That's the nutshell on steroids. Who has questions? Great question. Great question. Is it possible for a department, for a sheriff's office, to use the county records officer? Now, you guys aren't going to like this, okay? I get it. But in the world of records management, you guys are not constitutional officers. You are departments of the county. And that applies to circuit court clerks, commonwealth's attorneys, commissioners, and treasurers. From our perspective, again, in records management, in our database, you are a department of your locality. If your locality has a county, city-wide records officer, then it is certainly permissible to use them, because technically the agency, and that's what the code says, is each agency has to have a designated records officer. The locality is the agency, and you guys are the department. So if you, in agreement with the locality, want to use that locality's records officer, that is perfectly fine. If it's a small office, go for it. Most of the time, I find that in law enforcement, it really works best for you guys to have your own records officer. Because if that locality's records officer is really doing their job, it's going to take them a little while to get through your stuff. And that's why I do encourage, for the most part, that each sheriff's office have their own.
You may or may not be able to answer this question, but we have our own records office, or in the sheriff's office. 4 months into my term, when I got elected, I got sued federally over a FOIA request that went to the county, and they downloaded over 50,000 emails from the sheriff's office and released them. And now I'm in a constant fight with the county because they hold emails for the deputies for 3 years, but because I'm an elected official, they hold all of my emails indefinitely. So when somebody FOIAs my emails as the sheriff, they grow so much every day, it causes a major issue for me to comply with those FOIAs when somebody comes after my emails. So can you weigh in on the emails as far as retention for those? Because the county wants to hold all of my emails
because
forever.
you are an elected official.
Correct.
Okay. There's a part of that that I cannot officially answer because that's FOIA. That's the FOIA Council, and we really try hard not to step on each other's territory. But that is something that's got to be worked out between you and your county. But again, for records management purposes, you are not the agency, and you are not the agency head, and it is only the agency head, in your case, the county or the city executive, who's, and I'm not going to use the word email, because email is not a record. Email is a format. Email is a carrier. My hope is that when you say they're keeping it for 3 years, it's because they have identified it as a department head correspondence. which has a 3-year term. If that's really the reason that they chose to do it, I'll buy you a steak dinner, because I doubt it. But
because I'm an elected official and I'm a department head, the department heads throughout the county, they never, that's what I'm saying, they never get rid of them.
so my encouragement to you is, you go ask them, on what authority did you make that decision? Because they cannot point to the code and find it.
But what recourse do I have to stop it? Because the problem is the server is at the county. It's not at my office. So I have no grounds or no teeth to stop it or, make them destroy it. I don't have the records.
Do you have access to the records?
They're my emails, so yes, but I have you put them in your deleted file, then you delete your files, but they
Okay.
still have the
But
server.
they still have the server
So when
copy.
somebody comes after and FOIAs my emails, I have them since I've been in office. I have no grounds or no way to get rid of them. And every department head throughout my county, they have a stance in place that if you are a department head, they store your emails forever.
They have no authority to do that. The schedule says for department heads that it's 3 years. If it's a correspondence, and typically if an email, and I bet they're keeping every single email that comes into your inbox, most of which is not even a record to begin with. I didn't even touch on non-records today. But in an email, the vast majority of what comes into our inboxes is not a record and should be gotten rid of immediately, unless there is some type of informational or referential value to have for a small period of time. And when that value runs out, then you destroy it, and you don't report that destruction because it's not a record. That is the same, and I'm going to just take one little left turn here. That is the same thing when an agency makes a decision to scan all their paper records, put them into an electronic system, and declare that what's in the electronic system is now the record. When you destroy the paper, do not report that destruction, because that is not a record. I guarantee you that the first year, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, 9 months. When I came into this job, got law enforcement off the bat, the questions that I got the most after beating my head against a brick wall for about 6 months boiled down to using outdated destruction schedules and trying to report the destruction of copies. The vast majority of those emails are not even records. Now, they don't have any really great way to separate those. But there is no authority by which they have, unless they've come up with something I don't know, to hold a departmental head's email, which is typically correspondence. If there's something else that they're calling it, that they're classifying it as, I cannot imagine. The only thing that they could be doing, holding correspondence permanently, is if they classify all correspondence as agency head correspondence. So there's no authority for them to do that per records management. If they're making a business decision to do that, then I can just about guarantee you it's going to be one that's going to come back to bite them. Because they're just as responsible for those emails, for those correspondence, being subject to FOIA, being subject to some type of discovery. And just because you could have destroyed them and didn't, does not mean that they're not subject, because they are. But again, that's a business process, that's a business decision they're making, and you've got to deal with them on a business-to-business level. There's nothing in records management that we can do other than point them to the schedule and say, what's your authority to do this? And here's what are the potential consequences for you making these decisions. And if you want to reach out to me afterwards and we go have a conversation with your locality, I'm glad to do that. Who else? Yes, ma'am. Oh, Lord.
I asked Roy on this, and they told me to ask you.
No, I get it. I get it. Did you talk to Alan Gernhardt? I'm going to kick his butt. All right. Text is a format, just like email. It's a carrier. There is no record called text, just like there is no record called email. Just like there used to be no record called floppy disk or 8-inch disk or reel-to-reel drive. Those are carriers. It's however you all classify the content of what's on those, in this case, phones that are carrying text messages. I just had, yesterday morning, conversation with state police because they're getting ready to issue their troopers iPhones. And they had the same question. And I'm going to give you the same answer that I gave the state police. And it's a theoretical one because I know the day that this is practically worked out, it's going to snow here in July. Don't use a platform to create a record until you know how you're going to manage it. But almost always the cat gets out of the bag, cow out of the barn, depending on what part of the state you're from. There is no really great way to manage text records. And the biggest reason for that is because you do not own the platform. It's owned by the carrier. Just like if you are using social media. If you've got a Facebook page out there and you've got it open for public comment and you're going back and forth, guess what you're creating? Most likely, you're creating a correspondence. If it's documenting an activity of government, that part where it looked regardless of physical characteristic, it doesn't matter that it's in Facebook. As I heard no, that's too political, never mind. As I heard somebody say recently, Tweeter, it does not matter. If you are using any kind of a platform to create a record, then you're responsible, all of government is responsible for managing those records. And yes, they are just as subject to FOIA, they are just as subject to discovery. And how you classify them, that just depends on what they're doing. Is it just routine correspondence back and forth? That might be an other correspondence with a 2-year retention? Are they creating field notes that actually should become a part of a case file? How are you going to capture those? We really can't tell you how to do that because that is a business process. That's a function. That's a utilization of equipment. And we can't know everything that's out there. I can give you some suggestions on how to do it on an Android system. Do not talk to me about iPhones. Does that come close to answering your question? It's just, if you're going to use them, you have to know how to manage the records. Anybody else? And I really can't see. All right. Well, thank you guys. I appreciate you having me here.